The share, I'm going to head over to the lecture where we're going to cover chapter 7 and wrap that up, and then get into chapter 8 and 9. See where we wrap up at around right before 10. So we left off on chapter 7. We were talking about fallacy, reasoning, and the logic of our arguments, and we are on the fallacy section on page 145. And I just want to remind everybody that this is important. You should prepare to see this on the final exam or the quizzes. So some familiarization with reasoning and logic and logical fallacies, which are really, really common. And a great way to counter argue somebody when they put out an argument and you point out that it's a fallacy and there's a logical fallacy built into the argument. It'll really, really hurt their credibility and help you win the argument or the debate. So a fallacy is an error in reasoning. They are very common, but be kind of hard to identify or recognize, which is why they're great test subject matter. But a fallacious argument can lose merit. So you want to avoid the fallacies and then recognize when other people commit these fallacies. So the first one let's talk about is the false dilemma. And this is example. A dilemma is a hard situation, right? Like when you got to choose between a rock and a hard place. That's a famous quote. You know, both choices are bad, right? So false dilemma is when you make it appear like you're forced to make a choice and you really don't, right? So false dilemma might be like you're either for us or you're against us, right? I like forcing you to choose right then and there. And there's only two positions, for or against. There's no neutral. There's no kind of in between, you know, for or kind of leaning against. It's just black and white, right? And that's why we say the world isn't black and white. Actually, the world is usually immense shades of gray between black and white, right? So a good example of this might be like, I remember my mom, my ex-wife, she would tell my children, eat your vegetables or starve, right? So it's eat the veggies or starve. That's a false dilemma, right? Because there's many choices. You could eat many other things instead of just starving. But it's presented in a way where you have to choose, you know, and between two things, and it's a false situation. But that's why we say it's a logical fallacy, right? And people love to do that, right? I mean, think about how illogical that argument is. Eat your vegetables or starve, right? Or my way or the highway, or you're either for us or you're against us, right? So that's an example of the false dilemma. You put people into a situation, tough circumstance where they have to choose, and it's not the way you present it is false, right? There's many, many, many choices, not just two, like black and white. Okay, so let's talk about the second fallacy here, which is the appeal to emotion, not logical. And this is a great example is if you ever know what a lynch mob was, right? Let's go hang somebody with a noose, right? Because we're angry about something. Usually, maybe their race, or they in like an Emmett Till's case, he whistled, I believe, at the white woman behind the store counter, and brother-in-law and the fiance, you know, ended up hunting him down, a little boy from Chicago, and killing him. So you appeal to hatred, right, or anger. That's an appeal to emotion. That's not logical. That's also you know, a fallacy, because you're not doing anything logical. You're resorting to what your emotions tell you to do, right? And people are really easily emotionally manipulated. The most common political emotion that's manipulated is fear, right? Be afraid of these people, or them taking away your freedom or your guns. You know, be afraid of spies like TikTok. Which, by the way, I think that argument has some merit. If you don't have a persuasive speech topic, I think it's a great one. You know, should Congress ban TikTok? Yes or no? Choose a side. It's really fascinating debate. If you didn't know, we've banned lots of Chinese products and services in the past too. And I was reading that one of the biggest Chinese shopping websites actually has malware built into it where it can take over your computer, your camera, and your phone. So yeah, that's a great example of what could TikTok do potentially if the Chinese government, you know, ordered TikTok to do that, because they actually effectively control TikTok, right? The U.S. government doesn't effectively control Facebook or Google or Apple. They put in some laws to regulate them, but they can't like force them to do this or that. In fact, you remember the San Bernardino terrorists? They were a married couple that shot up San Bernardino in an act of Islamic terrorism. They got her iPhone after the woman was murdered. The killer, the terrorist, was shot and killed, and they wanted to look on it. And they asked Apple, "Will you help us hack open this iPhone? Because, you know, it's a terrorist phone. We want to see what she was doing, who she was calling, you know, texting, what social media she was using." And you know, and then Apple said no. But I think the NSA hacked her phone like in 6 hours. They were like, "Oh no, don't worry, we got it." But you know, Apple's really has a reputation for really protecting customers' privacy for that reason, right? But you TikTok, no. I mean, because theoretically the Chinese government could just order them to hand over all the information that's on TikTok for all the, I don't know, 100 million users in America that have TikTok accounts. Okay, so number 3, non sequitur. These are things that literally means not in sequence in Latin. So things that are irrelevant. So let's say we're talking about pizza and you bring up, you know, Japanese domestic motors cars like my modified Subaru. I'd be like, well, that has nothing to do with pizza. It's what you brought. Your topic is a non sequitur, right? So people logically or try to bring up not relevant topics for a lot of reasons to distract, to just get off the topic, to change the topic, and because they don't want to deal with this one. So non sequiturs are a really common fallacy that people throw out there, right? I might say, for example, we're debating like whether we should hire this candidate or A or B, right? And when somebody throws out there, well, you know, candidate A is a parent and candidate B is a bachelor at, right? Or like single. And you're just like, that actually is not relevant. And because that's actually illegal to hire based on whether the person has children or not. Right. And so I would say that's a non sequitur. It's not relevant to hiring A or B. We can't legally consider that, right? Slippery slope. The 4th fallacy. This is the very, very common one. If you do this, we'll go down the slope and it's slippery and we can never turn around and try and fix it or reverse it, right? So a common slippery slope argument I've heard is gun control. If we let them have a little bit of gun control, they'll implement more, and the NRA then says they'll take your guns away, right? Which is why you should be afraid and fund and defend your right to bear arms and the National Rifle Association, right? So they use that argument a lot, the slippery slope argument. Some people have said if you allow the right to die, right, like in euthanasia, that there's a slippery slope and that you'll slide down it and we'll devalue life overall, right? You know, which is maybe death penalty. Me kind of says that I crack up about pro-life people and the death penalty people because they're kind of the same. It's like, do you want to kill or do you want people to be alive? That one's interesting, right? So I actually do believe, I think that the death penalty should go away in this country. The European Union actually excludes it. You cannot be a member of the European Union and have the death penalty in your country. So they think it's barbaric, and you saw that earlier. We talked about the innocence conviction rate. There's a lot of false innocent people that get thrown onto death row, and that's just, for me, the death penalty is so final that you shouldn't allow errors to happen at all if you're going to do it, right? And then also, it's incredibly expensive, the death penalty, because they have a lot of legal appeals, and any death row inmate is going to use every legal appeal, right, to try and not die. And then ones who want to die are like, you know, suicide bombers or suicide by cop people, so they don't have to worry about that, right? So it's like, yeah. And then again, that one doesn't deter crime. So I personally think we should get rid of it in this country. Life without parole, possibility of parole, is a huge sentence. Prison in America is terrible. Prison in a lot of places in the world is really, really terrible. So I'm like, put them there. I think that's a great punishment rather than, so anyhow. The slippery slope, again, that's the fallacy, right? That you go, once you head down this direction, you can never reverse. So you should never head down that direction, right? I think another common example of a slippery slope, and by the way, you might be asked on the exam or the quiz to provide examples of the fallacies, not just to recognize them, would be, you know, if you try marijuana, you're going to try cocaine and heroin, and then you end up dead and homeless and in the street, right? This, like, that drugs is just like a slippery slope. Once you start, you'll just, you know, like, end up an addict at the bottom. You can't stop that path. Sounds pretty persuasive sometimes too, right? But it's actually a logical fallacy. That's because you can't just say X leads to Y leads to Z, therefore we shouldn't do it, right? Like and Z leads to A, leads to B, leads to C. So B for K to C, right? That's just a lot of causal factors that in a logical chain doesn't really merit. So ad hominem, this we learn means against the person in Latin as well. So you're insulting the person. So you're not using logic in the argument. You're just like, oh, well, you're ugly or you're dumb, right? I hear kids resort to that because they don't know how to logically keep on arguing a situation and they don't know what to say. So they start insulting the person, right? So that's also not logical. And is a good example of how people just resort to name calling, which is zero bearing on an argument, right? So avoid that one, yeah, and recognize when people do that. I mean, Trump likes to nickname everybody, right? Like everybody, he Pocahontas for Elizabeth Warren, you know, like Hillary Clinton was that nasty woman or something like that, and like and even he has this, right, and it's a way, think about that, that's just his way of personally insulting his opponent. And it's ad hominem, right? It has nothing to do with any kind of logic or reasoning about whether you should vote for who or what or support this policy or what. So it's just name calling. There are other politicians that do that too, but generally I think it's avoided. In the Senate and the Congress, it's generally avoided too. There's a lot of respect and decorum that goes built into that. That's why student Congress is a great way to facilitate the arguments, right? So because we actually do it in reality, and it's how we make the laws in this country, but also it shows you that we can do it in a way and not break down to like fistfights and stuff. Because as much as crazy stuff as we've had and politically divided our country would be, the Congress has never like devolved into a fist fight, right? If you actually go watch other countries' legislative branches, you can see examples on YouTube where like they get in fights. If you, for example, just going to stop the share and show you an example of this if you've never seen this. Let's see. Fist fights. Let's see. Yeah. Just see. This is kind of showing America, but let's see if we can go to epic political brawls from Business Insider. Yeah, you can kind of see that it actually makes the U.S. Congress look like saints. And it's just showing here. So in Hong Kong, this lawmaker hurled a pillow at the financial secretary. Macedonia, violent brawling broke out in the parliament over the 2013 budget. Police and riot gear had to be called in to break up the fight. The Ukrainian parliament descended to chaos. I don't know, the 2012 violence in the Ukrainian parliament here. The vice speaker of the Ukrainian parliament even tried to choke a deputy once. A year later, another deputy threw hot tea all over the vice speaker. This is all Ukraine. Turkish lawmakers, the guy's pulling on his tie. And then this guy's poking them in the face. They're Turkish ministerial MPs. I don't know exactly what they're mean. South Korea, they got in this like, he threw tear gas at the dude. And in Sri Lanka, they got all violent and when their president turned in his 2012 budget. Italian parliament, you see this fisticuffs break out. South Korea, they got in a fight over an environmental bill. In Taiwan, they had a big heated, this is pretty physical. So just the whole point is actually, if you really get it now, like student Congress is great because it just makes sure that we're never going to do, you know, the way it's just designed in America, we do a great job of not letting it devolve, no matter how divided and oppositional people get. You can see that in other places of the world. That's not true, though. It's very common, right? That lawmakers get in fights and really big conflicts. So, okay, so let's finish up the fallacies. The hasty generalization, we learned about this one in inductive reasoning section, chapter 7 as well earlier, that you generalize from a specific example to a whole, and that it's very common fallacy, because generally, right, just because you know one person or have one experience, that you can generalize from that to every other situation, right? And my example was a hasty generalization fallacy example would be that, remember, my friend is Juan, Juan is Mexican and Juan loves tacos. Therefore, specific to general, all Mexicans love tacos, right? So the question is Juan a fair, representative, typical example to generalize from? And if he is, then your hasty, it's not a fallacy, it's not a hasty generalization, right? Remember, generalizations are just probabilities anyhow. So okay, then we have so this is a very common fallacy that people are like, oh, that referee is a jerk. All referees are jerks, right? Like that's a hasty generalization. There is no one referee that you could just generalize to all referees, in my personal opinion, right? So, and then circular reasoning. This is when people just say it is true, it's true because it's true, right? It doesn't, there's no explanation there, and it just goes in a circle, and then you can't break the circle, right? So circular reasoning, you'll see that people will say, it's true because I said so, right? That's another example of circular reasoning. Appeal to ignorance. This is in this fallacy, the arguer claims that something is valid only because it hasn't been proven false, right? So a conspiracy theorist, we talked about this fake news earlier, love to do this, kind of shift the burden of proof. I have a conspiracy theory. It's up to you to prove it's not true. Instead of it's up to me to prove my conspiracy is true, which is where the traditional burden of proof lies, right? So the appeal to ignorance just says, remember, this is valid because you haven't proved. My example, I don't know if it's a fair example, but it's like if someone like my mom, she's very religious and believes in God, she's a Christian. She'll tell me that, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist, so God exists, right? Well, no. It's up to you to prove God exists. It's not up to me to prove it doesn't exist, right? You're the one trying to say there's all being, all knowing, all being, a thing in the universe, right? So, or I might just say, appeal to ignorance might be something like, oh, America has no systemic racism, because and yeah, I have to prove it hasn't been proved false, right? So people love to make that kind of fallacy too. So but people don't know, right? People will just say it's true, and they're ignorant about it, so they can't really question it or say, okay, that doesn't make sense, right? So the bandwagon fallacy. This is really popular in sports, and this is where everyone jumps on the bandwagon. That's a metaphor for what's popular. And so you do it just because it's popular, not because it's actually logical, right? So I remember when the Warriors win the championships, right? And Steph Curry's playing really well, and Klay Thompson's playing really well, and such and so forth. There's a lot of different Warriors over the histories of our championships now over the last 4 or 5, 6 years. But you see that a lot of people will start being Warriors fans, and they're doing it because it's the popular thing to do, as opposed to actually any logical reason they want to be a fan of the Warriors, right? Because they weren't a fan until the team started winning and everybody else started caring, right? And so that's example of bandwagon fallacy. Another good example might be like you start doing some fashion trend because everyone else is doing it, and you don't have any logical reason at all. You're just doing it because it's popular, right? And that would be example of your choice is a logical fallacy, because there is no logic in it. You're just doing what the bandwagoners are doing, right? So, and people, I know, does anybody here know somebody who's always just kind of always goes with what's popular and hip at the time, right? That's just their personality, and then they constantly shift that, right? Because cultural trends and what's popular and cool, changes over time. So, 2 more, to 3 more actually. So the next one is the post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is again Latin for after this, therefore because of this, right? So this one is a causal kind of fallacy where people say, I saw this happen, and afterwards it must be because of this, right? So you're like, I saw after the accident, it's therefore because of this is what caused the accident, and I know the person was texting, right? But then in reality you find out, no, they're a drunk driver. So but everyone thinks, oh, if you're texting and driving, right, usually you were distracted and you caused the accident. So it's just always like, after the accident it was because you were distracted by your phone, right? But there are other reasons that people crash their cars besides their phones, right? Okay. Another good one might be like, after the drug overdose, it must be because blank, right? People make some interesting assumptions about what caused the drug overdose, right? Or you might say, oh, they're going to end up homeless, right? After the drug addiction or drug overdose, therefore because of this, right? So something happens, and then you presume what the because was, right? So causal fallacy, right? We love that. People love to make predictions. So that's often that then predictions fall into a logical fallacy category. The appeal to pity. This one's, help me because I'm pitiful, not because I have any logical reason to help me, right? So does anybody give change to homeless people, right? That's generally, they have a little sign, they sit there. The women who are homeless who look at me for money, that one bothers me a lot. Guys, it's easier to ignore them a little bit, right? So just because someone's pitiful is not a logical reason to help them, right? So that's the comment. And then you also see the appeal to pity applies a lot to the appeal to emotion, right? Because pity is an emotion. You feel something like you feel bad for this person in the circumstance they're in, right? So, and then last but not least, we have the straw person fallacy, or what it originally was called the straw man, but I think the better way to express it is the straw person. It could be a straw woman. So in the straw person fallacy, the opponent's argument is distorted, misquoted, exaggerated, misrepresented, or simply made up, right? So your opponent has an argument and you just change it or attach something to them, does, in some way. So it's not real. It's the, like what scares away the crow, the straw man in the farmer's field, right? So that's why we call it the straw person fallacy. It's not a real logical argument. It's a straw man, a fake person to trick the crows or the birds. So this makes the argument easier to defeat, can also used to make opponents look like ignorant extremists. The refutation may appear to be a good one to someone unfamiliar with the original argument, right? So a common one might be political campaigning. You'll see the straw person fallacy say something like, don't support this candidate. She's a Nancy Pelosi clone, right? So like it's saying Nancy Pelosi, which is, for a long time was the enemy of the Republican Party. You associate her, that's the straw man, right, onto this candidate. They're completely different people, but because they want the negative association, they throw Nancy Pelosi along with this political candidate and say, well, if you oppose Nancy Pelosi, you should oppose this person, right? And so I would say that Nancy Pelosi is the straw person. It's not the actual issue is that like the real person, right? Not this straw person that the opponents created to distort, misquote, exaggerate, misrepresent, or just fabricate the arguments. So that's a really, really common one as well. People often intentionally misfocus, misdistort, misinterpret your arguments as well. Remember, a good reason argument actually listens to your opponent's arguments so you understand them and then know how to defeat them, right? Okay, which is why the question and answer part of Student Congress is such an important and awesome part of the assignment, because it really shows your intellectual ability, because it's gets you off the paper in the preparation. All right, so the focus of chapter 7, reasoning, what links your evidence to your contentions. Contentions are, right, a bunch of arguments put together that kind of generally should win you the debate. Reasoning is the process of creating or generating conclusions from evidence or premises, like deductive premises, like a syllogism. This is the logical part of your argument. In this chapter, we looked at logic and found that there are two general categories of reasoning, deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive, again, is big to small or particular, and inductive is specific to general. Deductive reasoning argues from the general rule to a specific conclusion and follows the rule of syllogisms. Inductive reasoning moves from specifics to create a general rule. Think of my example of Juan. Juan is Mexican. Juan loves tacos. Therefore, all Mexicans love tacos, or at least all Mexican dudes love tacos. And then we examined 5 types of inductive reasoning. Each type has tests that we can make to ensure the reasoning is sound. And then unsound reasoning is known as fallacies, or being fallacious. Reasoning fallacies in an argument allows us to reject an appeal that is illogical, right? So learn the fallacies and apply them, right? You might even see in Student Congress, when one of the classmates, you'd say, hey, that argument is a slippery slope, right? Or that argument is an appeal to emotion, not logic, right? Like the NIMBY argument, not my backyard. I don't want a nuclear power plant in my backyard. That's pretty much an appeal to emotion and logic. Appeal to emotion, not logic, right? So let's go to chapter 8, validity or truth, the critical thinker's approach. So what are we seeking? The truth, like what really happened? And we're going to find out. As a critical thinker, we seek validity because we often don't know the truth, right? Like, who killed Kennedy? We don't know the truth, right? We have all these interesting theories, right? So it's what we're really arguing for is validity. The way we come up with our arguments should be valid, as opposed to whether we actually know the truth or not, because most people don't. We just don't know the truth, right? Our memories are bad. We weren't paying attention. What really happened on 9/11? I don't know. We do know that planes went down, right? There's some facts, but it's like, how did this happen? Like, whoa, that's a complex question. Because you remember there was an FBI report where these 4 Saudi Arabian guys were learning to fly a plane in Iowa, but they didn't care about how to land. But so the instructor guys told the FBI, like, trust me, when you're learning to fly, everyone wants to learn how to land the plane. That's like the most important thing. And these guys were just like, oh no, we want to fly it, we want to take off. Landing, no, we don't care. And so he was just right in the episode. So that's a huge warning sign. You kind of wonder, like, why did we not? Because if we investigated those 4 Middle Eastern guys, you would have captured some of the 9/11 conspirators before 9/11, right? So like, interesting. How did that lead get dropped, right? And so like, we don't know the truth. We just don't know. The FBI, the CIA, and like all the government agencies involved with that, we don't know why that happened. So we just have to argue that we think this happened, and I have some validity behind the way I reasoned this out. And that's what we seek. Okay. All right. So according to Plato, the dialectic is the art of being able to pose questions and provide answers. They start with a hypothesis, right? It's a kind of educated guess, or as we would call it, a claim of fact, value, or policy. And through the discussion, add knowledge to test of the soundness of the hypothesis. We call this truth seeking. So page 151, right? So this is what Plato said, that when people argue, we can try and figure out what really happened, right? Is liberty really more important than life, right? Is there a truth to that? Is it potato or potato? Is there a truth to that, right? Well, so Aristotle's approach to argumentation focused more on persuading others. His philosophy of argument is actually embodied in the rhetorical approach. Aristotle's book, The Rhetoric, is actually generally considered the most important single work in the literature of the speech discipline. So book 1 of The Rhetoric opens with the definition. Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic, truth-seeking. So the rhetorical approach is maybe described as a process for discovering all available means of artistic persuasion on any subject. So if a stripper gets naked, him or her, by the way, to get you to throw money at them, think about that as persuasion, right? That it would fall under what we call the rhetorical approach, using any artistic persuasive means, right? Nakedness, your body, dancing, emotion, right? To get money. And so rhetoric, understanding rhetoric, right? Like if it's a persuasive speaker, you use everything, all the tools at your disposal to be persuasive, right? And that's why what rhetoric really means, to understand that now, right? So it could be verbal, it could be nonverbal. And so Aristotle's 3 persuasive proofs. Let's learn about these. They're ethos, logos, and pathos. I actually grade all of your presentations on ethos, logos, and pathos. So I ask, for example, for your speech on the death row case presentation, how was your ethos? How was your credibility? Did you know what you're talking about? Did you do good research? Did you understand? Did you know all the people involved, know how to pronounce their names? Were you fair? Ethics is just being fair. Did you talk about, what was important in the case, or not just make them look bad, like maybe kind of one-sided? Character, just, do I know you? What's your reputation? Your character, and do I consider you trustworthy? And did you cite your sources, right? So those are all things you assess in a speaker's ethos. And logos, you assess their logic and reasoning. I took a look at some of your inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning, and I'm looking for the reasoning that connects the evidence to the situation, right? And then your pathos is your emotional appeals. So during your death row case presentation, did you show some indignation when something, totally unjust was going on? Do you use inspiration, motivation, humor, shame, guilt, or anger, for example, to capture your audience's attention? And, but all these things, of course, can clash with logic. Because remember, we taught you there's a fallacy, the appeal to emotion. So, but that doesn't, remember, a good rhetorical speaker, because they use every means of artistic persuasion, you want to use emotional appeals because humans are emotion. Should I eat this cake for dessert? It's expensive and it's really bad for my gut. It's gonna make me fat and it's bad for my teeth. But the emotional part says, I love cake. You deserve dessert. It's gonna be all sweet and tasty. So you buy the dessert, right? And you see, that's a good example of your emotion won over your logic. But generally speaking, all the logical decisions are much better than because you're gonna have consequences of eating that cake for dessert. All right. So think about your ethos and everybody else's ethos when it comes to arguments. Do you trust this person? Do they have good character? Are they being fair? And are they credible? So when like a prosecutor withholds evidence, that's very, very, very unethical, right? Because they have evidence that might say their own case is not true, but they shit, they hide it because they don't want their case to be untrue, because then they lose in court. And prosecutors care about prosecutorial percentages, right? Like how many times do you win when you go to court as a prosecutor? It should theoretically be 100%, because you know, that because that means if it's not 100%, it means you are bringing cases that weren't true, right, or weren't valid. All right, so then be logical, using logos, and use lots of pathos though. So good speaker is has lots of great ethos, has great logos, and has great pathos, right? You feel the logic and reasoning, you feel you trust them, you like their character, you find them very credible, and then they made you laugh, and you felt some, you know, pain and suffering when they were explaining what they went through, maybe as like a victim of a crime or a rape victim, right? And you felt some anger about what happened to that person, and you want to like punish the wrongdoer, right? Okay, so ethos, logos, and pathos. All right, defining an argument, page 154. What are the parameters and topical boundaries of our argument and issues? So that's why we define arguments, you know, and this goes to relevance, because you define what we're debating and arguing, you have an idea of what belongs, what doesn't belong, and therefore what's relevant and what's irrelevant, right? So, and then jurisdiction is a legal phrase for, the best way for you all that understand it is, for example, CHP, the California Highway Patrol, what is their jurisdiction? Can they give you a ticket like on EVC's campus? No, that is not their jurisdiction. They generally control certain highways and expressways and roads, and that's it. Now, can a CHP officer chase you on to EVC's campus because you fled there? Yeah, right. There you go. And you also understand state jurisdictions, right? The FBI's jurisdiction is anywhere in the United States, but the deputy and the sheriff of El Dorado County, where I live, their jurisdiction is only the county borders, right? Unless they're pursuing a criminal. That's why we also have this process called extradition, right? If somebody commits a crime and then they live somewhere else, they'll be extradited to where they committed the crime, because the court, because the, you know, the evidence, the witnesses, the cops are all there, and that's what extradition is. So you move them to the proper jurisdiction, right? And juris is the Latin word for law, if you didn't know that. Okay, so the goals of argument. Is it the truth? Truth is the best word, best is a word best avoided entirely in argumentation, right? I can go to court all the time and they're like, oh, you know, they found this to be true and that to be true. And you find out it wasn't true at all. And we, you know, historiography, which we learned about earlier, really shows you that when you're trying to recreate the past, we really don't know what happened. We're guessing. But if you guess in a way that's valid, there's internal consistency, then that's going to make your argument pretty persuasive, because we just don't know the truth, right? Like, some evidence is very, very, very powerful, right? And so we can kind of generally figure it out, but like, you know, so many other situations. What causes the gas prices to be high in California? What is the truth of that? We don't know. We actually have formed a commission in California to study that. And because they want to say if the gas oil companies basically price gouge Californians, that there would be, we could tax their windfall profits, right? So that the idea being, if they raise gas prices just to basically make money on top of whatever else is going on, then or because they have a profit margin built into that already, that the California government can then tax the oil refinery companies, the idea being, and then return the money to the consumers, right? So, okay, but what really causes that price spike in California? We don't know, right? There's just, it's hidden. The truth is hidden, so we can't find it. So we want to have validity is the goal. Again, internal consistency. The way we arrive at our argument and our hypothesis, and then the way we prove it, is all consistent. And that's what we seek. So validity refers to the internal logic or reasonableness of an argument, given the data that is used in the argument is the conclusion that is reached a logical or consistent conclusion. If not, there is a fallacy or a misuse of logic in the argument. And we can look at page 159. You have the table that shows you kind of the truth versus validity examples. If you want to kind of understand better, like, oh yeah, you know, like, are we after truth or are we after validity? You can look at examples and it kind of clarifies, like, yeah, we're after validity, right? Because we just can't find the truth. Math is valid, right? The equation is internally consistent in the way you always, and everyone gets the same result, right? When everybody does 4 + 4, everyone gets 8. So you see that there's validity, right? Because think about, is 4 really + 4 really 8? right? Well, we made up the numbers 4 and 8, but you can have, just whatever you want to assign to it, just, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, right. There's validity to math. That's why math works. And math is universal, right? Doesn't we all speak 195 different languages on Earth, but there's only one math across the 195 countries, right? And that's what's fascinating. You see, because it's the math has a validity to it, right? Okay, so critical thinking defined, because we want to be critical thinkers focused on validity, not truth. So there are many definitions, but they have this in common. Critical thinking is a learned skill. So it's a skill that if you work on it and use it, you get better at it. That includes being skeptical. Don't believe everything you read, see, hear. Be open-minded. So be careful. Don't let your closed-mindedness and skepticism get too strong where you reject things that are possibly actually true because you're not open-minded to them. And understand that critical thinkers will criticize and advocate ideas. Okay, so one way of realizing the goals of critical thinking is by learning the skills of argumentation and applying those skills to everyday decision-making and conflict situations in our life. This is why I love this class, because it really applies to everything you do every day, the way you talk to people, who you talk to, the way you talk to them, whether you should talk to them or not. And these are all things that we have to decide every day in our lives. And a good critical thinker who you learn this, you can apply this every time you do this. This class can really improve your life. All right, so to be effective critical decision makers, we need to be able to analyze and evaluate the information we receive in order to determine the best course of action to take. Okay. So don't stick to the plan. Sometimes you get new information that changes everything and makes your old plan obsolete, right? And that's called like the sunken cost fallacy, where you're like, dang, I've already committed to this plan. I don't want to change it, right? Like, no, like things changed. You should totally change the plan because the plan that you made assumed this, but that's no longer true, right? So critical thinkers can be really, really critical and evaluative, but then you have to seek the information. Who here, if you buy a car, how many of us will do research? The different models, what's invoice price, right? What are some dealership prices as an example, as I get an idea of how much I need, and I start thinking about financing it, right? And you realize that if you buy a car, which is an important financial decision in your life, I think the average American buys 5 or 6 cars in their lifetime. So you should learn each time what you do it and get good at it. And I would think about like, I need a lot of information so I can kind of assess it all and then really make a good decision and figure out which car I really should buy. By the way, this is like the worst time ever in like the history of the country to buy a car, used or new, just FYI, right? So I would tell you, if you're going to buy a car now, it's out of sheer necessity. Otherwise, wait for a lot of reasons. So, okay, so and I've thought about that. I have 3 cars and I'm going to drive them for a long time and not change anything because it's not a good time to try and upgrade at all. I'm going to see if inflation comes down, dealer inventory comes back. We kind of have a transition between EVs and gas cars going on. And there's a lot of changes going on in the car industry, right? So, okay. So let's take a look at the critical thinking skills that we can work on individually and apply them and help with us. So skills can be learned and developed so we can improve our critical thinking and listening. So critical thinking is you're intellectually curious. Who here is intellectually curious? I'm going to raise my hand, right? Yeah. I'm, curiosity killed the cat. I'm definitely cat-like in that. I'm pretty curious about a lot of stuff in life. I'm almost scientific about it too. I mean, I'll talk about subjects matter. I'll ask people some things and, please don't get offended maybe, or don't answer if you think it's too personal, but what do you think about this, right? Because I'm intellectually curious about things, about people, about, again, just like a lot of people, what causes something to happen, especially in society. Right? Like what causes homelessness? What causes drug addiction? Is it an addictive personality where you can't help it? If you're exposed, you might get addicted, right? And I have a lot of people told me that, like, I have an addictive personality. And I was like, that's interesting, right? All right. And then critical thinkers are open-minded. So I think a good example of me is I went to a burlesque show here in South Lake Tahoe recently where it was cross-dressing men singing and dancing. And they were really good singers and dancers. They look pretty good, but they're all men. And I remember like right as the show started, the show was sold out. Probably like 1,500 people in the theater. And I remember I saw probably 5 guys all get up and just leave once they realized like what they were in for. I was thinking, yeah, you have to be pretty open-minded as like a kind of macho heterosexual guy to watch a burlesque show, right? Critical thinkers, are open-minded. So I think that's a good example, kind of realize like, yeah, I'm pretty open-minded about people and things and situations, and I've learned that I don't always know what's going on. I can't assume. And I was talking about this the other day about how many people I've met assume I'm financially well off because I have three cars. And I'm always, like I have an EV, a truck, and SUV, right? And they all have different purposes. So for me, it's very, very ideal as a pragmatic, practical manner to where I live, to have these three cars. But I notice that everyone sees that and always says something about it, and then infers that I must be wealthy, right? And I'm just like, I think you got to be much more open-minded and be careful about the assumptions that you make, right? And by the way, I know a lot of people who drive a really, really nice car and they barely can afford it because they know that other people are impressed by that or judge them superficially based off that, right? So, okay. Critical thinkers also avoid red herrings, right? That was the fallacy where you put in distracting, again, almost like the straw man fallacy or misinterpretations again that deflect people's arguments about and the focus on the argument, right? So the one that I always think about as a great red herring is, my mom caught me with my hand in the cookie jar after she'd warned me. And then she's like, "What are you doing, Peter?" And I'm like, "Mom, look, Mom, a puppy," right? Cute puppy. So that is a red herring that distracts you from the issue of my hands in the cookie jar, right? So critical thinkers avoid that because they're going to stick to the issue, right? And not try to create tangents or avoid issues by using red herrings. Critical thinkers are also aware of their own biases. Yeah. Over time, I've really learned about my own biases. For example, I remember maybe had a little bit of a bias against like homeless people. Like, I remember like in high school, we saw some homeless people and my friends were like, "Oh, they're losers," right? And you're just kind of like, "Yeah, they're homeless," right? And then you realize like, a lot of reasons that people end up homeless, and it has nothing to do with being or losing, right? Like you lost your house literally, but that's it. Or biases example might be towards, I used to think that like I remember my parents asked me something about like, we were going to buy a new car. And I was like, "You should get a Mercedes, Dad or Mom." And they were like, "Why?" And I was like, "Because, poor people suck and rich people enjoy Mercedes," or something like that, right? And you realize that you kind of, as a kid, you're learning this little elitist kind of bias against poor people and for rich people, right? And you're like, who do you admire? Bill Gates, Elon Musk, right? Jeff Bezos. Who do you not admire? The homeless, right? And so I was like, so you might have a bias against women or gay people or certain religions, or people who are older than you or much younger than you, and you just become aware, and again, you become more open. That really increases your open-mindedness. Critical thinkers also learn how to handle confusion. Confusion is disorienting and stressful, which is why your speeches should be well organized, because you don't want to confuse your audience about when you're making arguments, right? So critical thinkers will actually learn how to handle it, right? Because you slow down one thing at a time. Don't get overwhelmed by the situation or too many things happening at once. And that's a really, really good one. So if you've ever been in a confusing situation, you can diffuse it or kind of like fix it or get it back on track. It's really showing some really good, awesome critical thinker skills. So people get mad when things, it's more like, let's not get mad. Let's focus on getting out of this situation so we're no longer confused, right? Like when you're lost, right? People get upset when you get lost. Like, no, let's just get unlost, right? And that's a good example of how to handle the confusion. Remember, you're calm, cool, and collected. I think that's really, really important when you're doing debate, because you want to keep those emotions under check, right? One of the strategies, by the way, that I do when I'm debating and arguing with people is I try not to look them right in the eye. It's easier to be kind of like argumentative without having the stare down glare, which makes you emotional and upset with each other as you look at each other. Does that make sense? So have you ever seen lawyers in a courtroom? They look at the jury, not the witness they're cross-examining, right? Because you look at the witness's face, they're doing like they're either upset about the questions they're being asked. So you look at the jury, right? Because they're actually the people who are watching you and the juror and the witness and trying to figure out who's telling the truth or not, or who's more valid. And then finally, two more. Critical thinkers also are able to control and use their emotions. So we're about to learn about, I think, emotional intelligence, or we covered that already. And that critical thinkers control I think good human beings control their emotions, right? People who are too emotional Their life's too up down and they're too impulsive, right? They're the ones who become gamblers or become like just emotions help you make a lot of poor decisions in life, right? So be logical and have reasons for your decision. You don't always end up with the best decision, but you have a valid way of how you reasoned out to that decision, as opposed to, because, again, we just always don't, when you make decisions, they don't always turn out to the best, even though you thought it would, right? But just there's some things that are beyond your control. There's information you didn't know, right? So control your emotions. Learn how to have that poker face, right? I think that's a great skill. Just that's controlling your emotions, because if you are emotional during your poker game, people will figure out what you're doing and then bet it and use that against you, right? Because you're excited when your card you get like a royal flush, you're like everyone's gonna drop out and you're not going to win much in the pot, right? So that's why you want to be very, very kind of poker face. Don't hide all your emotions. There's some great examples of coaches who are really good at that, right? The game has lots of ebbs and flows, ups and downs, and you can't tell if they're winning or losing. Their coach is kind of consistent, right? And they really control their emotions. And every once in a while, because we're human, we let them out, at the end of the game when you win, right? So, and then finally, critical thinkers are sensitive and empathetic towards others. So we're sensitive and open-minded. We're aware of what we're doing, what we're saying, and how it affects the people around us. And we have empathy. We feel each other's pain and suffering. We know what that person has been through. I do a lot of mentoring, and a lot of what I mentor is based on empathy. I've been in your situation. I had this Persian kid who was taking my class in college. He was like, "Man, you and I are not the same." And I'm like, "Okay." I bet you, I was like, when I was young, I went through a lot of cultural generational conflict with my parents because they were Korean and I was American. And he's like, yeah, I have a lot of that because I'm kind of Americanized and my parents are very Persian, and Muslim, and I'm not. And I'm like, yeah, right, my parents are Christian and I'm not. And then I was like, and so anyhow, he realized I did actually understand his situation, even though I was way older than him and a different race and different culture, right? But when you immigrate to a place and the children assimilate and the parents represent where they grew up, there's a lot of clash there. If you don't understand that, there's a lot of clash. It's very difficult on the children. The parents usually just do what they know, which is how they were raised, right? So okay. Critical thinkers also can distinguish between a conclusion that might be true and one that they would like to be true, right? Because some people are overwhelmed by what they want to be true and making that a reality when it's not true, right? And I see that's a lot of people when they always say first step in addiction is to admit you have an addiction. So a lot of people who have an addiction, they don't recognize that, or they don't want to, right? Because they don't want it to be true, or they want it to be true. And that you just got to distinguish what versus what the reality is. Critical thinkers also know when to admit to not knowing something, right? Ignorance is bliss. The more you learn about the world, the more you realize you don't know much at all. So that's the paradox of knowledge. The more you know, the more you realize the less you know, right? Because there's so much out there. And then critical thinkers are independent thinkers. We don't go with the bandwagon. We don't go with what our friends do or our boss does or our parents do. We're always independent thinkers, right? And finally, we seek a dialogical approach to the process of argument, where again, we have a dialogue, and it's not just 5 minutes, right? And blurbs. It could be a decade of us learning and understanding each other by going back and forth and arguing. And then remember, we're not just trying to win, because winning means there has to be a loser, right? So a lot of people talk about family law, and they'll hire a divorce attorney and say, are we going to win? And every divorce attorney will say, in family law, there is no winning and losing. It's about, getting a fair result, usually for the children, if there's children involved, right? So, okay. So what does the critical thinker notice in these photos? You have the Capitol insurrection, January 6th, and you have the Black Lives Matter protests where the military was guarding everything. You don't even see a protester anywhere, right? And it's really shocking because it shows you that these guys are like somehow made it up here, and they're committing crimes, but the Black Lives Matter protesters weren't even allowed to even show up and go near any of the I think this is trying to recognize that in DC. This is the Capitol building here on the left. The Treasury Department or something, the Mint. Okay. It's not the Lincoln or Washington Memorial. It's not the White House. So now, all right. So you see that you should pick up on some things here. The irony of the security. None, the bad guys are here, and no security. There's nobody here, just American, they're often in there, but you have all the security ready, right? So the focus of this chapter, chapter 8. In this chapter, I wanted to focus on the history and goal of critical thinking. Key thoughts from this chapter include, remember, there's a historical foundation of critical thinking and arguing. Critical thinking is not a new concept. We've been exploring how we think and how we can improve our thinking for over 2,500 years. Thinking is what really separates us from every other species on the planet. I always tell my children, be a thinker, right? Like don't do things emotionally by impulse. You think about what you're about to do, right? My children are playing on the roof because I have so much snow. You can just walk on the roof of my house. And, part of me is like, they like just go up there whenever they want. And I was kind of like, is this a smart thing as a parent to just let your kids climb on the roof of a house? And it's just like, okay, well, a critical thing. I'm like, you know what? I'm not just gonna make rules and say like, don't go on the roof. And I want them to be critical thinkers. And I'm like, so think about, what do you think about the fact that you're on the roof and why? It's fun, right? Well, okay, but just be, should you be careful? Yes. Is it slippery? Yes. Now, the good thing is if you fall off the roof, chances are you're only going to fall a foot onto the snow that's piled up 8 feet, 9 feet around my house. So, but yeah, you're right. I just was thinking about, I don't know if I should be letting my kids, though, have free access to the roof, right? And my dogs go on it too. It's pretty funny. I have a picture of them they sit on the roof now and watch the traffic and people walk by or cruise by, and everybody's like, oh, they just notice like there's 2 dogs sitting on the roof of that house watching us, kind of like cats or something. Right? So the goal of argument, though, is actually validity instead of truth. We all want to know the truth, but arguing from the position of truth leads to dogmatism and hinders individual growth and actual conflict resolution, because often there is no truth, right? And there are many definitions and skills of a critical thinker. We went through a huge list of them. Being a critical thinker is not just to criticize others, but instead to be open-minded enough to evaluate arguments. And critical thinking is not a natural inherent skill. It's something, we're not born critical thinkers. Critical thinking is a skill that we all can develop and improve. You can make the argument that most humans, our brains, prefer simple. Critical thinking is not simple. So that's why you kind of have to teach yourself, don't do like the simple brain process, go for the critical thinking process, right? But you'll have much better results when you're a critical thinker. So, all right, let me look at the time. Got like 16 minutes. So let's talk about, let's see how much we get through chapter 9. It's about changing beliefs, attitudes, and behavior. So this relates to persuasion, because you're going to understand that people don't change beliefs often. People don't change their attitudes often. People can change behavior, but it's hard. So chapter 9 really shows you that humans are kind of tough to persuade at times. So let's learn about how to really become better at that. So beliefs. Well, beliefs represent all the bits of information we collect about people, events, and things in our life. They are cognitions that we have to discriminate. Cognitions are thoughts in our mind and selected from all those we have been exposed to relevant to any subject in our environment, right? So beliefs are measured through a true-false continuum. We tend to believe this is true, this is false, and these kind of is a good way to understand our beliefs. And we have a probability scale, just kind of like we have the certainty of continuum of certainty, like how certain are you that this argument is true versus 0 to 100%. We kind of have this also for our beliefs, right? That I'm like, 80% believe that this is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. And then there's, I think this has a 50% chance, right? So we kind of have this probability scale as well in the world. All of us possess beliefs about a college education. Right? They may include that a college education takes time, is a lot of work, makes our parents happy, and will allow us to make more money in the future, and so on. And that, by the way, belief is generally true. You do the research that says, I think a college degree versus a high school graduate, about $1.8 million in lifetime earnings difference. So that would tell me that, yeah, that the degree will make you more money in the future, right? So generally, probably. Right. So some beliefs are stronger than others, as we say, have more salience. Salience is like how relevant and connected you are to it. Right. So that is like, for example, for my parents, their belief in God and Jesus and the Bible is salient, 100% salient to them. Right. The belief is so connected to who they are and what they are, that it's kind of become the same thing. That is, some information about the environment is more important to us than other information, right? Such as how you are doing in a class as opposed to how another class member is doing, right? Like you care about how you're doing in the class. Most of us, it's not salient to us how somebody else in the class is doing in the class, right? We might help them if we can, whatever, right? But in the end, that we care about how we're doing. Right? So let's talk about the beliefs of a snake handling creature, page 178. So this is a great example of that. The snake represented the devil in this example, right? The preacher, so it's kind of like this paradox. Remember that the snake is also a symbol of healing. If you've ever looked at the American Medical Association symbol, it has the snake around the cross kind of thing, right? So you see that you can have some beliefs that can seem contradictory or paradoxical, but at the same time, yeah, right. I can handle snakes. They aren't the devil, right? So, but this is an even better one. This is a story that I read in a history book. It was about a Nazi soldier. So they found him. He was wounded. He was bleeding. So the American medics, they wanted to save his life, because even though you're the enemy, we generally, unless we have orders to shoot and kill like prisoners, no prisoners, but we'll capture you and try to save your life, right? So the Nazi soldier said, "Wait, before I get the blood." And they're like, "Why?" The American medics were like, "Why?" They were like, he says, "You have to make sure there's no Jewish blood. I'm a Nazi. I don't, and they were like, "We don't know if there's a Jewish person donated the blood." And then he was like, "Then I don't want the blood." And they were like, "Well, then die." And they let him die. And it just shows you that the guy died sticking to his beliefs that no Jewish blood. Right. And so yeah, you see that, your own beliefs can even, kill you. So values. These are a special subset or type of beliefs known as values. Remember, we had the claim of value. A claim of fact is a belief, right? And the values are just their judgments, or their enduring or long-lasting concepts of the nature of good, as opposed to brief ideas. They're kind of resistant to change. So what we tend to value, we never let go of, right? So for example, a lot of my friends who are Mexican American, they learn family is a value, like blood is important. Family's first. And I've noticed that value is taken by the children, and then they grow up, and then they have children, and they pass that value down, right? You see, so it's hard to change it, and they're really long lasting. They're also salient, really, really personally relevant. They're important beliefs. They're inflexible because they're so important. As we tend not to bend them at all, right? We like you can be dogmatic about it, just so stubborn that even with evidence in your face, you still won't say that's not true. And these are inflexible beliefs about the worth given to people, events, things, and philosophies in one's life. I remember my friend one time told me, "Oh, my dad leased a car," and I said something like, "Well, I think leases are bad deals because you don't end up owning the car; you're just renting it for a long time, right?" And I remember he got upset because he kind of interpreted it as I was saying his dad was dumb. Right. But more actually, his dad's super rich. And what I find out is that people who lease a car, even though they don't own the car, they always have a new car every 3 years. And then they don't have to worry about, they don't own it, so they don't have to do the repairs and it, right? When they drive it on lease, it's covered by the warranty. And then also they just kind of get to try a large automobiles, right? Because I have 3 cars. I've had these 3 cars for 6 years at least, right? So yeah, you see that it's a long time, right? Double the length of a traditional lease. So and then you ask yourself, what are American values? Think about the Constitution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We really value life. Look at abortion rights, laws against murder, how much we try and preserve life we feel very tragedy, sad and tragedy when lives are lost. Liberty, we really value freedom in this country. A lot of people say, even more like Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. I'd rather be free than alive. And then the pursuit of happiness. As long as you don't conflict with other people's pursuit of happiness, Americans should kind of generally do what they want to do that makes them happy, right? As long as it doesn't infringe on other people's happiness. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think those are 3 American values right there. Another one would be time. We really value time. And technology. We really value technology, right? So those are some other American values that I've seen in there. Okay, so values are enduring. Yeah, I mean, these are things that just last almost maybe forever. right? Because they're just passed down. And then values stand the test of time because they are tied to our basic human needs, because they are learned very early in life, right? Parents teach children certain values. Be honest, don't be too materialistic or too selfish, right? Learn how to share. Many of the values you possess are likely to be shared by other members of your family and community and have been passed down from one generation to another. They're a common bond that unites cultures and social systems and are seen as necessary for the continuation and survival of the culture and the social system. Values are also enduring because no acceptable alternatives have been found for those values. What's the alternative to liberty? Slavery. No, nobody supports slavery except for you're the slave master, right? Other than that, it's just, as a value, very, very, very right. I mean, people are liberty oriented, right? Or I would say I'm actually not liberty oriented. I'm what I would say call autonomy oriented. That I think people should be able to make their own personal choices about things, right? Autonomy. Like if you don't want the vaccine, yeah, you don't have to get it. Now, if you want to send your kid to a public school, I think that changes the variable. But your own level, like you should make the choices. I do believe in personal autonomy. I really do believe that people should be given choices. All right. So, what acceptable alternatives are there to values like freedom or equality or honesty or being forgiving or having self-respect, being loved, right? Hate. Just you realize that these values make a lot of sense and they're enduring, and the opposites are really ugly, right? So it's good to teach these other values. Now, values are also salient and lack flexibility. Remember, they're really, really personally relevant and they don't change, right? And they're enduring. Values are generally regarded as absolutes. Just, I like they're deal breakers, right? I freedom, liberty over death. Yeah. Think about the history of revolution and how many people fought for their freedom and liberty, right? So against oppressive kings and situations like that. Values have a tendency to take on the appearance of being certain with little room for flexibility, since values characterize things as good or bad, right or wrong, superior or inferior. They're rarely shades of gray, right? Which kind of tells you they can be kind of looked at as through the false dilemma, fallacy. But in this country, freedom of speech is valued. This, as with most values, seems to be an all or nothing situation, for it's difficult to establish partial freedom of speech, as the courts have attempted to do with the question of pornography, right? Yeah, I mean, the basic question is like, is pornography protected speech? That's an interesting question, huh? So once adopted, people will fight for or even die for their values. And this is especially valid for nationalistic and religious values. There are two categories of values. So psychologist Milken Rokeach has actually done extensive work with values. In his works, Mr. Rokeach says that there are two types of values that people possess. We have terminal values and instrumental values. Terminal and instrumental. You have a chart here kind of showing you the examples there. So terminal values are the major goals in one's life. They represent lifelong desired end states, right? So these are like the long-term goals, things that you're really working for that will take a long time. Instrumental values are short-term ways of living our day-to-day life. They are the goods and bads we follow each day, right? So terminal values, we want a quality of life. We want to have responsibility over our lives. We want to be innovative in our life. We want to have excellence in our lives. How to measure that one's interesting. How much money did you make? Economy, financial success, morality, you're not good, you're good, not bad, or evil. Profitability, yeah, right? Because we live in a capitalist society. So, okay. Now, instrumental values, these are more day-to-day things that help us get to the terminal values, and they are the goods and bads. So like, day-to-day, we work hard. Day-to-day, we respect your traditions, generally, right? We respect authority. We're generally conservative, frugal, but you're not always conservative, right? You'll go on a vacation and have a great time and go bougie for a week, right? But the other time you're frugal. You're creative on a day-to-day basis, and you're honest on a day-to-day basis, right? And these things, if you do day-to-day, will help you get to these terminal values, which are things that are end states, or what we call, the long game, right? People, these are the short game things, right? So, because I think in a good movie, you see that the bad guys or good guys are playing the long game. So what seems kind of hard to understand during the middle of the film turns out you're like, because they were playing the long game, right? So, okay. Time, sorry, check. Got 5 minutes. So value systems. So value systems are an organized collection of individual values such as honesty, kindness, and equality. Kind of group them together, right? These values are prioritized with the most important values on top and the least important on the bottom. Values are usually embodied in a set of moral or religious systems found in all cultures and societies. the 10 Commandments to just, you might have something like Hammurabi's Code or just the Boy Scouts, code of ethics to, whatever else. We may feel that all of our values are important, but when two more values clash, we have to decide which value is more important to us. This becomes a value system which guides your decision making. Remember, we had cost, what's CBD, BBH? Oh, chicks before dicks, right? What is it? What's the saying there? Bros before hoes. That's right. Right. So you kind of see that like that's a value system. Like, should you date your friend's ex? Right. Kind of goes to the values of loyalty. Then it goes, but that conflicts with like, I want that man or woman now because they're not dating my friend, right? They're single. And so my want versus loyalty, and you have a huge conflict there. You have to make a decision, right? So that can be tough for some people. That's why they always say be loyal, right? Chicks before dicks and bros before hoes. So how are values learned? Great question. We learned earlier that just your parents, your teachers, your friends, and community and society will kind of at an early age will start sharing, like imprinting these values on you. Moralizing what's good and bad, right? Could be religion, school, just telling you don't steal, don't lie, like tell the truth, don't bully kids. Modeling, we model the behaviors and values and people pick up on them, right? So you might see your star athlete or your celebrity modeling, their appreciation or reflection of this or that value. And people are, big about celebrity influence in this country, celebrity idolatry. So experimenting, we often experiment and with choices and kind of test our values, right? Like a good example of that might be you might experiment with some people who are you've met and you're kind of like, they're a little bit different from me, or they're not the normal type of people I might hang out with. So, but you're experimenting, and then maybe you find out, yeah, they're involved with something. I had a rule, like when I would meet people, sometimes you would meet people that were friends of friends. I was just like, if they're shady, which could be criminal or just something I don't trust about them, I was like, just stay away. I really learned that in life, that there's nothing really good about having those kind of people come into your life. So you experiment that to kind of figure out where your boundaries are, right? In terms of what you value, in terms of, like honesty or just kinship or empathy or some moralistic values or religious values that you connect over. There's that dating website like plentyoffish.com that's only for Christians, right? So you only meet other Christians like that, and everybody else has been filtered out, right? So then there's clarification, like for example, honesty is a value. When should you be honest? To whom should you be honest? I had an interaction with a ranger, National Forest Service ranger this weekend, and we were really honest with him, and he was super appreciative of that. But I was kind of like, we have nothing to hide, right? So why wouldn't we be honest with you? So that was actually a great interaction. I was telling the story a lot this weekend. Everybody was like, yeah, it's cool when you have good interactions with law enforcement, huh? Because generally they tend to be negative. You're getting a ticket, or you're in trouble, or you're getting arrested or something. So all right, attitudes. I'm going to end off here.